Hey, what's up guys? In this Lightroom Classic tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use the effects panel and apply a vignette to your image or make your image look more film-like using the grain tool. Before we get started, I'm going to use the basic panel and cheat a little bit here and apply some basic adjustments using the auto tool, which is similar to using the green box of death in a DSLR or mirrorless camera, which is the auto option. So I recommend don't use auto when you're taking photos with your DSLR or mirrorless camera. Anyways, let's get to the effects panel. So vignette, a vignette is applied to an image to give more focus to the subject or to an area of an image. And by using the amount slider here, I can apply a bright or white vignette, or if I scroll to the left or push the slider to the left, I can apply a dark vignette. Usually for the white vignette, it's applied to fine art photography or portraits or anything else you can think of, but most of the time, most photographers will be applying a shadow or dark vignette by moving the amount slider to the left. So this vignette, I'm just going to stick it to around 50, minus 50. You can see the highlights. The vignette looks pretty good here, and the darkness or the bottom corners here, it's a little too dark. We'll correct that later using the different options in Lightroom Classic with the vignette tools. But I'm keeping it at minus 50. Actually, I'll keep it at minus 100 to next demonstrate how the feather works. So the feather controls the transition of the vignette. A soft feather, which is 100, gives it a softer transition or a smoother transition going from the vignette to the actual image. So it controls the masking of the vignette. But if I select a hard vignette by changing the feather to 0 or pushing the slider to the left, the transition becomes hard. Yeah, you can see it right here. Anyways, I'm going to keep the feather at 0 just to demonstrate how the midpoint and the roundness works. So the midpoint affects where the center of the vignette starts or where it's applied. So if I move the slider to the left, the vignette starts vignetting more around the sides and the corners, and the image is a little bit smaller, or the revealed part of the image is smaller by moving the midpoint to the left. If I move the midpoint to the right, the vignette transitions out or moves out and reveals more of the image. And if I push it all the way to 100, it's almost like there's no vignette except in the corners here. And now with the roundness affects the shape of the vignette. So if I move it to the right, it becomes like an oval or circular shape. If I move it to the left, it becomes like a square or rectangular shape, as you can see here. So when you're using or applying a vignette, you want to balance it out by using the amount slider, midpoint, roundness, and feather usually. So I'm just going to make this vignette a little bit better. I'll keep the midpoint at 50 and the roundness at 50 as well. Usually the midpoint and roundness at 50 usually does a good job, but the feather, you may have to play with it to give it a better vignette, especially if it's in the corners here. So I'm just going to keep the feather like this. And now the highlights slider, it affects the highlights or recovers highlights in an image when you're applying a vignette. So you can see the shadows here, it's pretty dark. The highlight section of the vignette, it's actually not as dark. But I can recover more of the highlights if I want by changing or moving the highlights to the right. And you can see as I push it all the way to 100, there's less darkness in the highlighted corners at the top and the top right and the top left. But let me just reset that and keep it at here. You can see one problem here is with the bottom corners. We'll correct that a little bit later, but I'll correct it actually a little bit right now, but there's better tools right here to correct the corners. So anyways, this is the amount slider at minus 15, and now this vignette looks pretty good. I'll push the midpoint actually to the center a little bit more, and that looks fine. Now you can see this post-crop vignetting. So what that means is the vignette is applied to the crop after it's cropped. So just to give you a demonstration, I'll crank up this vignette a little bit. I'm going to go to the crop tool by pressing the keyboard shortcut R. I'm going to change it to custom. uncheck the lock or the aspect ratio here. And now I'm going to play with the crop, and now you can see the vignette is adjusting to the new crop. If I move the image around, the vignette is still adjusting the corners of the new crop, and if I press return or enter, this is the vignette and it's applied to the cropped image. So anyways, I'm just going to reset this, go to that shot, and that looks good. Actually, the vignette doesn't look good, but the crop looks good. So I'm just going to give you an example now of these different types of styles. So there's highlight priority. The highlight priority is similar to the highlight slider. What it does is it recovers the vignetting of the highlighted area, or tries to keep the highlights in the image when you're vignetting. So let me just give it a better vignette right now. The best way to show you an example of highlight priority works is by going to color priority. So what color priority does is it tries to maintain the color and evens out the vignetting and the color in the corners here. So now you can see the shadows. It's not as dark here in the bottom left and bottom right corners, and there's a little bit more color here. There's also a little bit more color right here as well. But in this image, color priority works better because highlight priority, it only keeps or recovers the highlights, but it doesn't recover the dark shadows right here. So color priority works here and it maintains more of the color, but in my opinion it maintains more of the corners as well as some of the shadows in this example. Then we have what's called paint overlay. So paint overlay, what it does is it applies white and black pixels to the corner and kind of tries to balance out the vignette. But the one thing about paint overlay is when it balances out the vignette, it does not do a good job of keeping the contrast or the saturation. So let me give you an extreme example here. Let me reset this feather, and here's an extreme example. So now you can see here, actually no, not an extreme example, let me keep it at around -40. So you can see the corners right here. The vignette is applied, but the corners look soft. The image looks a lot more soft, except in the middle, but in the corners it looks soft, or it looks flat, I should say, because it has less contrast and less vibrance or less saturation. So if we compare the highlight priority to the color priority to the paint overlay, in my opinion, on this image, color priority works best. Highlight priority doesn't work too well because the shadows are not recovered, only the highlights. So I hope you guys now understand how the vignetting works in Lightroom Classic. If these tools don't work while you're adjusting it and trying to balance out the vignette, the only other option is to use the masking tool. You would need to apply a custom mask using the brush or linear gradient tool. If you want to see how the masking tool works, then make sure to check out my other video, which is in the description below. Now I'm just going to reset this. So here we have the grain tool. So what is the grain tool? The grain tool, as it sounds, it just adds grain to the image. You may be able to see it on this screencast. Let me zoom in here. So now you can see it here. Let me move the slider to the left. So what it does is it adds grain to make your image look a little bit more vintage, or to make it look like a film image. Usually what an older Kodak film or older Fujifilm photo looks like. And now if I apply the size slider, I can adjust the size of the grain or the pixels. If I move it all the way to the left, it looks more pixelated. If I move it to the right, it looks a little bit more blurred out with the size. The roundness tool, sorry, not the roundness tool, the roughness tool, it impacts the randomness of the grain. So if you move it to the left, the grain is a little bit more uniform. And if you move it to the right, it's a little bit more random. It's hard to tell while you're looking at it or on this screencast, but that's what the roughness does. Usually when you're adding grain, usually the size of 25 and 50 is pretty good, and you just need to adjust the amount slider. One thing you may notice is some of this fringing here. That was covered in another tutorial, but I can remove the fringing or the chromatic aberration by just going to lens correction and clicking on this, and there you go. So I'll just zoom out here. Hopefully you can still see the grain. Let me go back to effects. Let me click the grain. Let me change the size a little bit harder. So now you can definitely see the grain. The image looks a little bit more film-like, or looks like it has more noise, and looks like a film photo from 30 years ago, maybe. Let's see what happens when I change the roughness. So the grain looks a little bit more uniform, almost looks like it's on metallic paper here when the roughness is at 0, but when it's at 100, it just looks a little bit messed up and more random. So hopefully now you guys know how the effects tool or the effects panel works and how to apply a vignette to an image, or how to make your image look film-like using the grain slider. If you guys enjoyed this tutorial, give it a like, subscribe, and check out my photos on Instagram. As always, live easy, sleep breezy, and stay lovely.